ready to start it up and just give the little announcement that we'll be starting soon and giving people a chance to join?
Yep, I will start broadcasting in 3, 2. So I will give the announcement. Welcoming everybody.
Sure.
Okay. Hi everyone, welcome to our webinar, Minimizing Identity Verification Risks for CCPA Data Subject Access Requests. Be ready for July 1. We're just going to take a moment for people to come in, and then we'll start shortly.
All right. Hi, everyone. My name is Scott Handler. I'm from Wirewheel, and thanks for joining us today. We were just given a few moments for people to join, but I think some more will be joining as we enter here. And thanks for joining on the topic of minimizing identity verification risks for CCPA data subject access requests, as CCPA is getting ready to fully go into effect in less than a month now, and then the implementing regulations have gone into effect. In order to discuss this issue, we have two great panelists that are joining me today for this discussion. Next slide, please. And I will let each introduce themselves, but Aaron Illman from Bradley is going to provide us the perspective of CCPA and the pending regulations and changes that we can expect coming forward. Eric from IDology is going to be able to talk about identity verification, the tools and best practices within the space, as well as some recent survey work that they've done to be able to understand the issues that are out there around identity verification. And then I'll talk about some of the risk management along with that area. And again, my name is Scott Handler. I'm from Wirewheel. I'm our CISO, as well as our VP of Strategic Initiatives. And I'll talk about Wirewheel just briefly in a moment after Eric and Aaron introduce themselves. Aaron?
Thank you, Scott. As Scott said, my name is Erin Illman. I am a partner and chair of our privacy and cybersecurity practice at the law firm of Bradley, Ariant, Bolt Cummings. I'm a board certified specialist in privacy and information security, and also a certified information privacy professional. Been practicing for a little over 15 years now, and have spent the last 2 years focusing and assisting clients with CCPA compliance.
Hello, everyone. This is Eric Liserson. I'm the Vice President of Research and Marketing for IDology. As part of those responsibilities, I handle all primary and secondary research relative to consumer trends, business trends, and insights relative to fraud, identity verification, authentication, and the best practices that goes with it. Scott, back to you.
Thanks, Eric. And so just as a quick overview of who we are at Wirewheel, we're a privacy tech platform. We're focused on building the platform for all companies' privacy needs to be able to manage from privacy program management all the way through subject rights request fulfillment, and to be able to offer a full suite of tools to be able to do that with, and working with partners like IDology in order to help our customers minimize their risks, as well as others along the way. And so today we're going to focus around our subject rights components as they relate to the California Consumer Privacy Act. And Eric, if you want to give a quick overview as well of IDology.
Yeah, sure. Thanks, Scott. Briefly, IDology, we're the leading provider of identity verification and authentication solutions in the person not present space. So we focus exclusively on digital channels as well as mobile. In that, we were founded in 2003. We're a GBG company, which is UK based. So we have a great deal of international capabilities. We also have an anti-fraud consortium network made up of thousands of companies across industries, and our dedicated fraud team that is utilized to track trends and flag our customers as to potentially fraudulent activities.
Thanks, Eric. And then Erin, if you want to give a quick overview of Bradley and then dive on in, please, into the topic around CCPA.
Sure. So Bradley is a full-service law firm. We have offices in 6 states and the District of Columbia. My team in particular is focused on privacy and cybersecurity. We have about 40 attorneys within the firm that focus on privacy compliance issues as well as cybersecurity issues across different areas and different practice areas. So within healthcare, within financial services, contracts, M&A, we deal with privacy and cybersecurity issues as they pop up in those different industries. So,
and Erin, can I just make one, sorry, I didn't mean to interrupt you there.
No,
for everybody
okay.
who's the attendees, if you have questions along the way, we're going to answer questions at the end, just because of the format between Zoom and the challenge of trying to have it fully active, that our moderator fell through for a moment. So we'll read the questions as we come through at the end, but if you have anything that Erin, Eric, or I address during our discussion, please feel free to send those along our way so we can then address them afterwards.
Thank you, Scott. So I'm going to jump right into CCPA. So for anyone who hasn't read through the 16 pages of the statute itself, I'm going to walk through kind of a high-level overview of what that includes. So CCPA, which is now codified in the California Civil Code, went into effect on January 1st of this year. It encompasses 8 consumer or individual rights. Those include things like general disclosures, that ability to provide the consumer with information about what a company is collecting. There's also a general notice, which is a notice at the point of collection, and a website privacy policy. Verifiable requests that can be made by the consumer, a right to know and a right to delete. Different opt-out requirements for information that may be sold. There's actually an opt-in requirement for children under the age of 16. There's access and portability requirements that are built into the statute as well. That right to deletion that we talked about is part of a request that can be made. And then equal services on equal terms is also built into the statute. There's some additional business obligations as well. Companies have to train their employees. Those contracts that you have with your service providers have to have very specific language in them now and have to meet specific criteria in order for that third party to be a service provider. And the company has to create methods and policies and procedures relating to how consumers exercise these rights under CCPA. There is a security requirement, and there's also a private right of action for data breach. And this is something that is important, I think, sometimes kind of set aside when we're thinking about building out CCPA compliance. There is this obligation to ensure that information that you're providing back to the individual is done in a secure method, and that you're making sure you're providing it to the right person because of this private right of action for data breach. So we can go to the next slide now. So in addition to the statute itself, there is also these implementing regulations. So the statute requires that the California Attorney General adopt regulations that establish rules, procedures, and exceptions to facilitate compliance with CCPA. The final version of those regulations were released just less than a week ago on June 1st. The final version largely reflects the March 2020 version of the modified regulations. There were actually 3 versions that were produced by the California AG for comment. And this latest version, the final version, very, very similar in substance to that version from March 2020. The implementing regulations provide some new definitions that weren't in the original statute. And for the purposes of this webinar, we're focused on verification. There are lots of other pieces of CCPA, but I'm going to focus on the verification requirements within CCPA. So these two new definitions, this third-party identity verification service, which is specifically defined in the regulations, is laid out to allow companies to use these third-party verification services as part of their verification process. Verify is also defined within the statute to mean, or excuse me, within the implementing regulations to determine that the consumer making the request to know or request to delete is the consumer about whom the business has collected information. And you'll see this a couple of times in the regulation that there's really a focus on ensuring that the individual who is making the request is the person that the information belongs to. And so we can go to the next slide. So in terms of thinking through what is a verified consumer request, there's a couple of pieces to that. An individual can request specific pieces of personal information. They can request categories of information about them, and they can also request their information to be deleted. Now, one thing that is important is we kind of understand what the specific pieces of personal information are. We understand the deletion requests, but there are actually 6 different categories of information that the individual can request outside of that specific information in those deletion requests. So it's important to know that if a request is made for categories of information, you need to look at all 6 of those categories that are listed under the implementing regulations. Verification itself, again, the focus is on establishing a process for verifying the individual, documenting that process, and then complying with that process when verifying that individual. The next slide, please. So there are 2 standards for verification. There's what's considered to be a reasonable degree of certainty and a high degree of certainty, depending on what kind of request is made. So in determining the method by which the business is going to verify the consumer's identity, the business needs to consider what information that it may have, that it can match that identifying information that the business already has with what information the consumer is going to provide. And then the regulations also want to make sure that you're not collecting types of personal information that are considered to be sensitive personal information or information that could be subject to the data breach statute if that information was disclosed to the wrong person. So those are things like social security numbers, date of birth, financial account information, health information. Those are the types of things that you want to avoid using and collecting in order to verify the consumer. It's also the type of information that you would not want to provide back to the consumer, and there's actually an explicit exception to providing that information as part of a request. So the key factors that have to be considered are going to be the type, the sensitivity, and the value of the personal information. And the reason that it's really important to think through these before you get a request is because there is that short timeline. So a request has to be responded to acknowledging the receipt of the request within 10 days under the regulations. that request has to be responded to fully within 45 days. So that means you have to get the request, you have to look to see what type of information that individual is requesting. Is it specific pieces of personal information, which are going to require a higher degree of certainty and may require you to verify that person in a different way and at a higher standard? Are they categories of information? Is that person requesting categories of information, which means you may have a lower standard of verification? So you've got to figure all that out. Then you have to actually verify the individual. Then you have to search and find that information that relates to that individual, and then you have to provide it back to them within 45 days. So you can see, just based on that timeline, that those 45 days could run really quickly by the time that you have walked through all those steps. So thinking about how you're going to verify someone on the front end and making sure that you have that process in place is going to save you time and ensure that you meet that 45-day obligation. Some other factors that need to be considered are going to be the risk of harm posed by any kind of unauthorized disclosure of information. The likelihood of harm, and this kind of goes to, is there, are there particular individuals, are there particular types of criminal activities that are going on that make that type of information particularly vulnerable? Protection against any kind of spoofed or fabricated request. So if you have reason to believe that it's not a, not a true request, not an actual individual who's making it, then you may have to take additional steps in order to verify that individual. The manner in which the business interacts with the consumer. So if you always interact with your consumers by phone, that's one of the main ways that you interact, and you get an email from someone making that request, think about whether or not that individual would have normally called the number versus an email. And then what kind of technology is available for verification itself. Next slide. Okay, so I'm going to pass this over to Eric at IDology to talk a little bit more about identity verification and these access requests.
Yeah, hey, thanks, Aaron. And so the whole question that our customers have been asking us is, what is offering reasonable methods of verification? What is the best, least resistant, least friction way to do that? And from our experience, safe and easy identity verification, it's not straightforward. So Aaron talked a lot about some of these avenues and considerations and dependencies. And when we talk about safe and easy, often these are mutually exclusive terms in digital engagements. But this is especially true in the CCPA managed request world. It's a balancing act. It's a balance between fraud and friction, and it is the number one problem facing our customers. So ultimately, the question that we are posed, and we have been posed for the last 2 years, is how do we meet CCPA compliance with these verifiable identity requests, and how do we do that securely with low friction, make it easy, make it low effort, and make it low cost? And the other side of that, as Aaron pointed out, is around the security of it, because sometimes we find that people think CCPA compliance equals CCPA security, and that is certainly not the case. So what I want to do is take Aaron's legal perspectives and thoughts and the way she couches it, and then pull that into use case flows. And as we peel these back, we can see what the requirements are that are presented and all the complexities and dependencies that we have to plan for in order to comply and mitigate that real fraud risk, while at the same time not turning off our legitimate high-value customers. So if we advance to the next visual, and this is not a visual that I typically would share in this kind of presentation because it's overwhelmingly chaotic, but this in fact are the various use cases and permeations that can spin off from a CCPA identity verification program. So according to our analysis of all of these different types and permeations, there's literally hundreds of combinations that firms need to be prepared for. So if you start on the left and you move along to the right on that top, I think we can all agree the lion's share of requests are going to come from online customers with a registered password protected username and password. And they're going to go through the online channel. And depending on that nature and sensitivity of the request, like Aaron mentioned, like, for example, delete or share, they may have a dual factor authentication or second factor, such as through a mobile one-time verification. So the majority are probably going to utilize and move through this rather automated, streamlined flow. But there's other kinds of requesting types and channels and methods, the decisioning process, communications that have to go into this. If there's not a determinant or a determination when an identity verification method a request is made, there's got to be alternative methods that are presented. And this is especially true if you have high sensitivity information. So if it's not conclusive, other forms have to be presented. And it is important to note that when there's a failed verification request, companies need to give additional options and reasons back to the requester as to why that was denied. So it's a more complicated user experience. It presents a much broader risk surface for fraudsters to pounce on. There's more fraud vectors that fraudsters have to work with to compromise your data and your customers' personal information. So a lot of complexity, a lot of cracks. And it can be a kludgy interaction for legitimate customers who are, requesting their information at a moment of trust, which can make or break the brand experience. So check this infographic out on IDology.com. And the next graphic I want to present has the overall workflow and how identity verification fits into CCPA throughout that life cycle. And it boils down, in this case, the way we did it, to a who, how, when, what in the CCPA life cycle and value chain. And there's different kinds of requesters and how they make that request and when the request is made, so that impacts the length of time to respond, as Aaron mentioned. What is the nature and sensitivity of that request? Is it deleting health records versus viewing web history? And so these are all the determinants that go into ultimately determining which verification methods get presented and utilized. And again, I just want to say most will go through that straightforward, automated, low friction method in a registered username and password flow. But as the graphic showed before, there are literally hundreds of different combinations that may even be mandated depending on your business model and your industry. So the next set of data featured in the next chart that we have here is around the uncertainty of how many Californians have or plan to submit a CCPA request, and what is the profile of those most likely to do so. There hasn't been a lot of data direction relative to the number of Californians that are going to request this information and how many. So we asked Californians in our most recent third annual Consumer Digital Identity Survey, do you submit or did you submit or plan to submit a request, a CCPA request? And 79% say yes, they had planned one, or they have submitted one, or certainly plan to do so. So that math equals out to 28 million adult Californians that have that plan to do so. And ultimately, when you back out those with internet, that means 22 million. And their average is around 3 to 4. Ultimately, it's going to deliver somewhere in the neighborhood of 113 million CCPA requests. Now that's a higher end of what I think a lot of us expected, and surely people may say they do one thing and actually do another. Nonetheless, it's a data point for us to sort of factor in. The other takeaway here is that the research around the demographics of folks that are most likely to make these CCPA requests, they skew younger, they have higher incomes, and so it's possible to assume that these cohorts may possess deeper knowledge of their illegal rights and a technical proficiency to make a lot of noise around the legal elements of this, or even the brand, and share that. So moving on to the next series of questions that we pose, we're also interested in pulsing non-Californians about their interest in CCPA. So data from our 7th annual fraud report that we conducted in last September had 65% of fraud professionals believing that CCPA-like requests would be granted to other states in the 12 to 24-month time frame. So as things are progressing now, we don't see that as happening at a national level. Nonetheless, 85% of non-Californians say they would support similar legislation as CCPA, and 87% said they'd make these kinds of requests. So we did not dive into the intensity of that interest or whether or not people are going to really feel strongly into voting for it. Nonetheless, it is still a consideration as we look into the long term and what we can expect. And so ultimately, in the next set of data that I want to share before I pass it along to Scott, is we want to find out the types of identity verification methods Americans expect to encounter when they make these kinds of requests. What are we expecting? What are they expecting us to deliver? And so nothing too earth-shattering here. The first is a website with a password, email verification, one-time passcode, the mobile scan of the license, knowledge-based authentication. But the one question, or the one option I'll really call out, are the all of the above options, all options. And that's the takeaway here, that consumers at this stage, Californians, they want multiple options to prove who they are when they're exercising their privacy rights. So to make this process easy and streamlined, to make it quick, to make it low effort, those are the important things to do, because ultimately you want to have a secure and engaging experience for all of these customers. And so with that, I'll pass it over to Scott.
Thanks, Eric, and thanks, Aaron. This slide we're going to actually just quickly cover, because I think that a lot of it of what Eric just covered in showing the risk that's there, but is to show again the records of the level of challenges that arrive from CCPA. And because CCPA, it's not just about privacy risk, as Aaron mentioned, there's also the data breach risk element to it, and the security component and the potential penalties that can come with that, and class action that also exists within there. So having a secure means around identity verification, as well as the whole subject rights process, is really an important component as the proliferation of data has gone out there, and the sensitivity of this data, as Aaron has mentioned, and why it's really a risk approach that needs to happen. So this is just to show the scale of the types of records, whether it's by a security breach, or is it misuse of data and different elements that may happen about the data leakage that may happen. And so if you can hit next slide, please. We're going to look at assessing it from a risk standpoint. And what we try to do in working with our customers is understanding, is all of our customers ask, what do I need to do to minimize the risk around identity fraud and the fulfillment of the subject rights process? So two main areas, and we know that Aaron mentioned, right, there's a few different types of requests that people have the rights to. We're focusing here on the opt-out, delete, and the access requests, so just three of the types of requests under CCPA. And it's not just about a compliance point, but where those risks enter. And there's parts of the risks that enter at the beginning and externally, and then once the request comes in, then the risks internally evolve. So do you act on the risk? Do you confirm the information? Are you aware of the information that you have? So going back to just some of the basics of conducting a data inventory and a risk register, and having that knowledge about the information you have and what's requested within each of these categories. But as we drop down in the bottom half of the chart and look at the external risks around risk categories, specifically with the risks or CCPA requests, we're focused around regulatory risk and identity risk. So the regulatory risk that exists is just the basic compliance components. And there's a few parts there, again, with privacy risk that's related to it, and then also breach risk that you want to be in compliance with, of the timeline on the privacy risk. Did I complete my request or acknowledgement in 10 days or 45 days, as Erin mentioned? So what am I doing from a compliance standpoint? But then on the identity side, what am I doing, as Eric said, to prevent fraudsters from requesting information, maybe even seeing the wrong person and potentially sending that back to them? And then also, what am I doing internally to mitigate the risk of, say there's a John Smith that's requesting it, to make sure it's the right John Smith and understanding the data I have, and then also verifying back before I deliver that information, I'm still sending it back to the correct person. So not just a fraudster, but also potentially sending the information incorrectly to the wrong person, because it may be John Smith I'm responding to, but the wrong John Smith I'm responding to. And those are some of the internal risks that I'm mitigating around that identity of verification, of why it's so important to know that who is requesting is the person, as Erin described, right, with using a third party, but also what verify means. I'm verifying that the identity of the person matches the information that I'm sharing back with that person before I send it. And so next slide. And this just gets back to some of the definitions about the requirements that are under third-party verification, or the business that would happen around that, is that a business may require the authentication, but in light of the nature of the information requested, and that if you use a third party, it doesn't have to actually create an account to be able to share that information, be able to do that. So you don't add any extra frictions or burdens upon the consumer to request the information. The one thing that's nice, though, around the third-party component of the verification is, what are you doing to take the best-in-class tools that are out there that have fraud protection built in, but also allow you as the customer, so in use cases with our customers, in both B2B and B2C, are asking to not collect more information. So by using a third party, they're also minimizing the information they're collecting in order to fulfill the requests. And so we help our customers reduce that request or minimum risk in this process. Next slide, please. So some of the lessons that ended up driving this, and I'll talk through once we get into the next couple slides, specific use cases with some of our customers, was under GDPR as an example. So at the last Black Hat, the big hacker convention, to be able to test security measures that are out there, under GDPR, there was a research team that looked at fulfilling data subject access requests in the GDPR landscape. And they were able to send out to 150 different companies these fake requests. Some companies replied back to those requests that were out there, and you can see that, and then actually fulfilled those requests, and how did they go about. So those lessons learned about what can be done to protect from that risk, and then what is, the concern if you don't have the right procedures in place, especially with class action and breach risk, and if it's not the best security measures that you're putting, or reasonable security measures according to the CCPA language, that you have to put in reasonable security measures, are you open yourself up to potential liability as well if you don't fulfill the process correctly? Next slide. And so here are just some of the benefits of using a third party. What are you doing that's in a systematic way to approach the different weak entry points? So where Eric showed those two slides in the flow, where they've looked at all the permutations and the different risk factors or risk vectors that are there for fraudsters or fraud vectors, what do you do to minimize those and come along? It's also demonstrating compliance, that you're not collecting the additional information that you need in order to fulfill the requests. There's a faster turnaround through the processes that are there, and identifying them through the tools that like IDology is using for identity databases that they're checking against for government ID that we work with. And then the accuracy of that going against the templates, the public records, selfie matches, other tools that are there, knowledge-based assessments that you can do, and then the flexibility to adapt to the organization's risk tolerance. I can talk about some of our customers based on the data that's requested. We'll maybe start with, if it's a known customer with a login, just as Eric said, username and password of a verified user. But if they're requesting specific sensitive information, then they can branch that and then request actual identity verification to even further confirm that the consumer is who they are before sharing that information. And so based on the risk matrix that our customers go through, based on the type of information and data they've collected on their consumers, they then prioritize what are the different means and tools that they'll do, or a combination thereof. Next slide, please. And so this shows, right, with the automated identity verification, it's not the holy grail. There are a lot of different ways, but the whole point around using identity verification techniques and the different ones is risk mitigation. What are you doing to reduce the risk that's out there of a fraudster trying to do that? And so we have multiple customers that use either just the identity verification as a way to be able to do it, some that are using a combination of user ID and identity verification, meaning a government ID, or even using knowledge-based questions or an affidavit. So for using under CCPA for parents requesting information on minors, that the parent who's requesting the information or the guardian to sign an affidavit saying who they are and actually verifying that along the way with their identity as they then do their own identity verification to try to minimize that risk of sharing a minor's information. So all different ways that customers are looking to do it, and all based on the level of risk. So that's why having tools that are able to introduce are one ways to enhance the prevention of fraud upfront. And then based on the categories of information, as Aaron said, the sensitivity to go with that, a company is able to scale up how much verification they put onto it and which tools to use. Next slide. And so within fulfilling data subject access requests and looking at it holistically of that 45-day timeline that Aaron says, like the WireWheel platform, you can manage the whole process all the way end to end. And so beginning from that verification and authentication of the requesting of the identifier using the IDology tool, or potentially just a login or password and configuring it from that way. But then the ability to then track and assign the requests, manage the flow, and actually pulling the information, whether you automatically do that through the orchestration tools that are available to pull the data that was already identified in a data inventory and risk management or risk matrix, to then share that information back with the consumer if it's an access request, or to delete and automate the process, or assign it to the right individuals to do. Then once the information is gathered, for example, of an access request, how do you encrypt that data, securely deliver it back, and again, confirm the identity of the user or the requester before sending back that information, and to be able to then, again, minimize the risk to yourself and the consumer that you're sharing that information with. And then lastly, to be able to track your whole process and be able to demonstrate to the regulators that you completed not just the timeline, but that you took all the appropriate steps to be able to fulfill these requests using the best practices available in the industry, best practices that are out there. Next slide, please. So I'm going to turn this over back to Aaron, but just talking about a few of the predictions to come, because subject access requests are something that we've been working on, both us and IDology with GDPR, applying it now to CCPA, but then also some of the upcoming regulations and the new version of CCPA that's coming out, as well as consumer behaviors that are out there about what are we going to do next and continue beyond this space, and the new types of consumer requests that will be there, and how to use identity verification to support the prevention of fraud and provide the most secure platform, as well as the least friction-inducing platforms in order to provide that support to your consumers and build trust with your customers. Yeah.
So in kind of thinking about what's next, I think Eric's slide is very telling in terms of, what we are going to see after, CCPA. So just the numbers themselves, 85% of individuals in 49 other states would support legislation similar to CCPA. And then 87% of those individuals would submit requests under CCPA. And we're already starting to see some of this, percolate throughout the states. As you can see from this slide, there are several states that have introduced privacy legislation, comprehensive privacy legislation that would be comparable to CCPA. You can see that, and the lines are a little bit difficult to see. You can see that several of these states, the bill has either died in committee or has been postponed, typically because there's some impasse in terms of how the bill is built out. But there are several that are still alive and active, and we'll see through the next legislative session whether or not those get passed. Arizona, Nebraska, Minnesota, Illinois, South Carolina, New York, New Hampshire, New Jersey, Connecticut, and Rhode Island are all ones that we're kind of still watching to see what happens. Hawaii as well. I missed that one down there. So I think what's going to be next is you're going to see other states start to take comprehensive privacy legislation and put it in front of the legislature. I think you've got state residents who want to see privacy legislation passed. And until we get something on the federal level, I think you're going to start to see the states really take the laboring oar in creating this legislation and rolling it out on a state-by-state basis. So we can go to the next slide. So in talking about kind of all of the different states that may be rolling out privacy legislation, we also have to turn back to California. So California has what's considered to be CCPA 2.0, or it's called the California Privacy Rights Act. This is another ballot initiative that will go on the ballot. It appears on November 3rd of this year. And kind of talking back about kind of what individual consumers want, I was at a conference in the fall of last year where the individuals who are behind CPRA and were also behind CCPA were on stage giving a talk about canvassing California residents about whether or not they wanted additional privacy legislation. And when they were doing their canvassing, they said that the only time that they had ever gotten a response that was greater than the one that they were getting for new privacy legislation was in relation to stopping human trafficking. So there is this really, you can see this wave of interest from consumers to have additional privacy legislation. So this will go on the ballot in November. If it passes, which it looks like as of right now, it's going to have the requisite number of signatures to go on the ballot. And if the polling holds up, it will likely pass. This is going to be a much more comprehensive privacy bill. And in fact, some of the expansion of rights are going to include an expansion of the initial notification obligations and expanded requirements relating to the privacy policies and what has to be explained and disclosed in your privacy policies, separate notifications relating to the collection and use of sensitive data, and sensitive data will have a separate definition in terms of what is sensitive data, and then individuals will have the right to limit the use of that sensitive data as well. There will be requirements to implement retention policies, which is something you don't see in CCPA right now. Companies will have to create retention policies that prohibit the retention only for what's considered necessary and proportionate periods of time. There's express information security requirements above what you see in CCPA. There's additional contractual obligations with service providers and third parties. There's going to be a new right of correction where individuals will have the right to correct the data that a company has on them. New consent standards. So in other words, your general terms of use that says that by using our website, you agree to allow us to process data. That's no longer going to be allowed under the definition of consent under CPRA. And then this expanded right relating to the ability to opt out. So right now, CCPA deals with the opt-out of selling information. CPRA is going to include an opt-out in terms of sharing the information. So there's going to be this shifting from not just selling, but sharing with any other third party. The individual could potentially have the right to opt out of that, depending on whether or not there's a legitimate business need for sharing that information. So just in kind of terms of quick timeline, this will go on the ballot November 3rd, 2020. By July 1st of 2021, that's when a new agency will be created that will enforce CPRA. The 12-month look-back period begins January 1st of 2022. There will be another set of regulations that are adopted by the agency. and the effective date will be January 1st of 2023. So I know we're looking, a couple of years out, but again, things to start thinking about as you're implementing your program so that you don't have to redo all of your CCPA compliance and your verification process and everything else, in another 2 years. Start thinking through what's coming down the pipe. And that's sort of a wrap up on kind of what's next. I think we are at the point where we can take some questions if anyone has any questions that they'd like to ask the panel.
Great, thanks, Erin. First one I think I'm going to direct to Eric of a question that we got here is, are you seeing specific industries or company sizes adopt a third-party ID verification vendor?
Yeah, so the question around size of companies and industries, it's across the board, Scott. If they're impacted and have to be CCPA compliant, they're looking for help. We're often finding some of the smaller companies don't think through some of the additional layers or risk factors. They sometimes attribute CCPA compliance to CCPA security and these other avenues that are really important, do's versus don'ts kind of a thing. So, but we're seeing it across the board from major retailers to smaller retailers and everyone in between. Financial services a little less so because they have a lot of those systems and privacy and compliance built in. But pretty much any other industry, they're all, and some of which you've not heard of, right? Rewards points, for example, marketing transaction companies, companies in the background. It's a myriad of different types of companies, different sizes of companies. And the important thing to realize is it's across the world. Any company that has Californians and operating above a certain amount of revenue and those two other types of determinants have to be CCPA compliant. So it's all countries, all sizes, all industries.
And we're seeing the same thing with our customers from B2C, major telecoms, consumer retailers who are doing it, FinServe, then looking even B2B with the MarTech, ad tech space, a lot of companies in there that are doing it, people who gather any sensitive information. So it's really interesting to see the same. Erin, then, I think for the next one too, I think I'll direct to you is, what might you expect the outcome to be around individual state data protection laws should federal legislation take root? So such as CDPSA 2020, will Fed supersede state legislation outright?
So this is $1 million question. If I had a crystal ball, I might be able to give a 100% answer on kind of what's going to happen between state and federal regulation. What's interesting is that we are seeing some more federal legislation around privacy. So I think COVID has forced the legislature, the federal legislation, to kind of build out some consensus around what might be in a federal privacy bill. We have two competing bills, one from Democrats, one from Republicans at the federal level, but it's specific to health information and data collection as it relates to COVID-19. But we can see from that there is this agreement, it looks like, in Congress between this idea of providing notice and getting consent to collect certain types of data. So I think there is going to be this movement towards potentially seeing some federal legislation with some semblance of agreement on what's going to be in it. The key issue is going to be the one that you point out. Whether or not it's going to preempt state law. That is something that has been a huge fight right now. States really want to be able to continue to have the right to regulate privacy at the state level, so they don't want preemption in federal law. And then the other thing that you see a big fight over is a private right of action. Should individuals be able to enforce these privacy rights through litigation, or should it only be through a regulator? And that's the other big question. And I think when you see federal privacy regulation is when you're going to see some type of consensus at the federal level around what that privacy bill is going to look like on those two key issues.
Great, thanks, Erin. I'll take this one, and then we have a few more questions, so we'll look at time, and I think that Eric, you may be able to jump in as well from what you're seeing. But do you have a point of view on the best practices for companies subject to both CCPA and GDPR and expecting others wanting to automate or outsource verification? So what I'll say here on this one is that what we're seeing specifically about is we have multinational companies that are dealing with both. And that's why looking with a partner example of IDology that we can be able to provide an offering that allows consumers to do that. And where it really matters for around automation and outsource of verification is the ability to scale. Because as the volume is increasing of these requests, and as Eric showed in his slide, the expectation of volume, and whether, again, that was a maximalist view, or even if you pare that maximalist number down, the volume to deal with, especially on certain sectors of companies, there's no way to be able to complete the 45-day requirement or the 10-day acknowledgement and even get the process going and be there without being able to scale. So to be able to do that, we don't see a way to do it without automation and of verification tools. And where outsourcing matters is taking the expertise of people who have built best-in-class tools. And that's why we're partnering, like with examples with IDology for government ID verification, is to be able to take the best-in-class tools that are out there that allow that scaling to take place. And that's what I would recommend is that would be, our point of view of best practices and why we built that in to the system, but also allowing it from a risk management standpoint. You can choose, again, based on the type of information, the risk tolerance that you have, if you just use an existing username password of a known customer that you already have, or even then maybe scaling it to, besides government ID, to use a knowledge-based questionnaire or assessment to be able to do it with, as well as another alternative that's in there.
Yeah, and what I would add to that, Scott, is you don't want to do this manually, and you don't want to be in a position where there is a wave of requests coming in because you're on the clock. Expect a number of different requests from attorneys, no offense, Aaron, to kind of probe and see what you are or are not doing. You'll die a death of 1,000 identity verification requests if you want to do this manually. And then, of course, there's all the escalations or not to escalate to alternative methods. And you really want to be able to have that in one tight sort of integrated platform so that it's very flexible. You just kind of push it out. It's very safe. It's very secure. And it starts to also become friction free. And ultimately, you're going to have an Amazon effect in e-commerce. And what I mean by that is, once somebody experiences a really easy, safe, secure, streamlined CCPA request from one company, they're going to have that expectation across all kinds of different companies, irregardless of their size, irregardless of their industry. So those are some things that you want to factor in as you're preparing for the program and enforcement starting next month.
Great, thanks, Eric. The next question dovetails off a little bit of it. I think I'll start, then Eric, if you have another view, and then I think there's even a legal perspective, maybe Aaron, to draw into this one as well, is regarding identity verification. I have a focus on GDPR for some years now. We experience problems concerning identity verification because many companies ask for copies of the ID card of customers. What do you think about ID copies being a good or a bad tool for identity verification? Since consumers cannot be required to create an account, I assume it's likely we will experience many companies require additional data, such as ID card copies as well in California. So what we're seeing here is by requesting a copy of the ID, a company is actually exposing itself. If they're keeping a hard copy or an upload of the picture in their own database, then they're controlling more personal information by having that copy of the ID or requesting it via mail, that someone send the copy of the ID to respond to it or uploading it into their own system. The difference in using and why we've done this for our customers, and again, using the third party as a way to minimize this risk, is we don't require someone to create an account in order to do this if a customer chooses not to verify their identity. And when they go through the identity verification, they'll take the picture for ones that use government ID, like with IDology as our tool for this. They'll take the picture of the government ID front and back, match it up, and then the customer also can set the parameters for retention that happens. So then the data is minimized, our customer never actually sees the ID, they never control the ID, they never are exposed to the risk of that information, as well as the potential of the breach of the information. And so the identity verification happens against all these known databases that, again, the best fraud ideas of why it's a best-in-class tool that's out there, to then be able to verify the identity of that consumer against the government ID that they use, and then to purge that information so then that data is no longer retained and our customer is never exposed to that risk of retaining that government or the ID copy of that. So that's where we see is the future, as well as, again, that ability to scale it, do it, but it's also a major data minimization risk component by not actually taking copies and asking our companies taking the actual ID card copies of their customers, and think that that is a best practice that we're seeing implemented across a wide range of our customers across sectors and size of companies as well.
Yeah, and Scott, on top of that, I would echo and tease out a very important remark you made, and that actually was from the questioner. A consumer does not have to sign up and register for an account in order to make a CCPA request. And so there is a use case that's really important, because how do you verify that identity if they're not in your system and they don't have to be? And so mobile identity scan or taking a picture, snapping a picture of your driver's license, and then liveliness detection through a selfie is an excellent way of onboarding that request and verifying that identity. And it's something that consumers are growing more and more comfortable with. Remote deposit capture, taking a picture of your check and depositing that, is really a mainstream technology now. And roughly 20% of online Americans have taken a picture of their driver's license, for example, to prove their identity and uploading it. So American consumers are doing it. It's an excellent way of having that done, especially if the consumer does not have, because they are not required to have a registered username and password.
Yeah, and one thing too, I'll just add from kind of the legal perspective is, companies who are considering doing this themselves, there is a part of the regulation, of the implementing regulation that was finalized, that says that the company has to avoid collecting the types of personal information identified in a particular civil code section unless necessary for the purpose of verifying the customer or the consumer. So there's going to be two things required there. One is, so this particular type of personal information is going to include driver's license number, specifically spelled out in the regulation. So if you're collecting driver's license number, you're going to need to create a documented reason for why that information is necessary for you as the company to verify that individual. So just keep that in mind, as you're starting to think about collecting particular types of information.
And we have time for one last question. I think we can all probably also jump on this one. Are companies now required to respond to opt-out requests sent by global privacy controls like Jumbo Privacy? More generally, how should a company handle requests sent on behalf of consumers using a privacy control app, et cetera? I mean, I would add also beyond that, I think, Aaron, if you can jump in first from the legal standpoint, the ability of outsiders to be able to make requests on behalf of other people, right? And then I can talk about what some of our companies are doing, and then Eric, what you're seeing as well.
Yeah, this is a really interesting question, and I will tell you it's still being very hotly debated among privacy professionals as to what's required under the implementing regulations of CCPA. So there's two questions here. One is, can you have third parties making, kind of mass requests under CCPA on behalf of individuals? And the answer is no, in terms of the request to know and the request to delete and that type of thing, because the party who makes that request has to be an authorized agent. So they have to jump through a couple of different requirements in order to meet that definition of authorized agent in order to make the request. So it's a little more difficult for big companies to just kind of make these big global requests, at least when it comes to the individual rights. Now, the opt-out is different because there is not the requirement to verify an individual who makes an opt-out request. So there's no verification process to ensure that the person who's making the opt-out request is the person that they say they are, they can just opt out of selling their personal information. And the company has to abide by that. The question is whether or not these kind of automatic controls, this kind of do not track technology that the individual consumer can push out to websites that it goes to, whether or not that's going to be a sufficient opt-out request and whether companies have to treat that as an opt-out request. And right now, like I said, this is kind of hotly debated. It looks like, based on kind of an initial reading of the implementing regulations, that that is something that may be required. I think we're probably going to look for some more guidance from the California Attorney General on how that's expected to be done in a practical way, and also what the expectations of companies are to automatically look for those particular, do not track beacons and technologies that individuals may place as they visit from website to website.
And what we're seeing customers saying from the opposite side, then we are out of time here, is on the opt-out, I'll say we'll talk about, if you're interested more about it, we can talk about our do not sell with you, reach out to our team at the end. We can talk about suppression lists and what we do with do not sell. On the side of the authorized agent for access requests, what some of our customers have done is set up specific portals to verify authorized agents, and then doing a special authorized agent workflow that they build in to then allow for that process of who an authorized agent would be, whether it's for a household or whether it's a company that's authorized on behalf of individuals, what the process is for them to become that authorized agent, and then what their requirements are to identity verify the individual that the authorized agent is allowed to do for. So they're setting up some processes around that. Next slide, and then Eric, if there's anything just to jump on, but otherwise, thanks everybody for your time. We will respond back to one last question that just came in separately, but thanks everybody for your time. We have hit the point. We appreciate everybody joining today, and thanks Erin and Eric for all the informative information that you were able to share.
Take care, everybody. Thank you as well,
Yeah,
Scott.
thank
Really
you.
appreciate it.
Thank you, Scott. Thank you, Eric. Bye-bye.
Bye-bye.